Imagine a world where a single country controls the brains inside every phone, car, and supercomputer. What if China, already a manufacturing powerhouse, could make all the advanced chips it needs on its own? How close is that vision to reality? In this video, we'll explore how far behind China is in semiconductors and what that gap really means. China's leaders have dreamed of semiconductor self-sufficiency for years. Back in 2015, Beijing's Made in China 2025 plan set a bold target: to produce 70% of the chips it consumes by 2025. At the time, this goal sounded ambitious. Some might say unrealistic. To put it in perspective, hitting 70% would have required nearly all new chip factories worldwide for a decade to be built in China. Yet the plan underscored China's determination to catch up. Fast forward to today, 2025 is here, and China is still importing hundreds of billions of dollars in chips each year. So, how big is the gap now? Let's break it down piece by piece. Imagine trying to sew an intricate pattern using a blunt needle. That's essentially China's predicament in advanced chip making. The most cutting-edge chips today require EUV lithography, extreme ultraviolet machines, to etch tiny features with nanometer precision. China has 0 EUV machines. Dutch supplier ASML, under US pressure, won't sell them to China. This means Chinese fabs must rely on older DUV deep ultraviolet lithography tools and clever workarounds. For example, multiple patterning involves exposing a chip multiple times with DUV to mimic what one pass of EUV could do. SMIC, China's leading foundry, reportedly used this tactic to produce a 7-nanometer chip, even without EUV. But what does that mean in practice? It's like drawing a complex design by overlaying several stencils. Alignment becomes tricky and yields suffer. In fact, when Intel attempted a similar quad patterning approach at 10 nanometers, it ran into serious yield problems and delays. Huawei and SMIC now plan to push this DUV trick further, aiming for 5-nanometer class chips with quadruple patterning, since they fundamentally lack access to EUV. It's a testament to Chinese ingenuity, but also a reminder of the extra hoops their engineers jump through. Meanwhile, TSMC and Samsung print 5-nanometer and 3-nanometer chips using EUV as standard practice. The bottom line: on the lithography front, China is running a race with a handicap. It must stretch older tools to their limits, while others use the race car of chip making. Semiconductor progress is often measured in nodes: 14 nanometers, 7 nanometers, 5 nanometers, 3 nanometers, each representing a new generation of technology. So, how many generations behind is China? Today's leaders, TSMC, Samsung, Intel, are ramping 3-nanometer processes, with 2 nanometers on the horizon. In contrast, China's most advanced chip manufacturer, SMIC, only achieved a 7-nanometer process in 2021, and that was in very limited production. Tech Insights analysts who examined SMIC's chip were impressed. It was truly 7 nanometers, and a remarkable feat without Western tools. However, they also note SMIC's 7-nanometer uses less aggressive scaling. Effectively, it's more in line with an early 7-nanometer, roughly equivalent to Intel's 10-nanometer, than the most advanced 7-nanometer variants elsewhere. Crucially, SMIC has struggled to move beyond small batches at 7 nanometers. High-volume manufacturing at nodes below 28 nanometers remains very challenging for them. Indeed, nearly 95% of Chinese-owned fab capacity is still on 28 nanometers or older nodes. In other words, only a single-digit fraction of China's fabs can even attempt what TSMC or Samsung were doing 5 to 7 years ago. This gap isn't just about hitting a number on paper, it reflects a broader focus. Most Chinese foundries are entrenched in mature nodes, 28 nanometers, 40 nanometers, 65 nanometers, which are used for things like microcontrollers and power management chips. These older chips are still critical. Cars, appliances, etc. need them, and Chinese firms excel at them. But the lucrative, cutting-edge market, chips at 7 nanometers and below, makes up a big chunk of industry value. One Chinese analysis notes that the truly advanced segment, below 7 nanometers, plus specialized processes, account for about 70% of the market's value, while the mature process segment, where most Chinese firms play, is only about 30%. Right now, Chinese companies are largely absent from that 70% high-value arena. Unlike TSMC's roadmap, which is plotted down to 2 nanometers, China's roadmap remains stuck at 1 generation behind 14 nanometers, with a nascent toe at 7 nanometers. Only approximately 5% of China's foundry capacity is at 14 nanometers or smaller nodes, most of that being SMIC's lines and a bit from foreign joint ventures, illustrating how narrow the advanced end of China's chip spectrum is. The country is racing to change this. SMIC and others are building new fabs, notably 3 big plants in Beijing, Shanghai and Tianjin. But tellingly, all are for 28 nanometers and older technologies, each 100,000 wafers per month of capacity focused on mature nodes. China is doubling down on volume at tried and true nodes, even as it tries experimental runs at 7 nanometers. The node gap, therefore, is significant. At least 2 generations in logic, roughly 5 years by time, e.g. 7 nanometers versus 3 nanometers, and similarly several years behind in memory chips and other areas. The coming years will test whether China can leapfrog from 7 nanometers to something like 5 nanometers using its non-EUV tactics. A leap that took TSMC and Samsung massive R&D with EUV. Chips aren't just made with dreams and engineers. They require an army of ultra-precise tools and specialty materials. Here lies one of China's biggest bottlenecks. Despite years of investment, China still imports the majority of its semiconductor manufacturing equipment. In fact, from 2017 to 2022, China imported $93 billion worth of fab tools, more than any other region in that period. These are the lithography scanners, etchers, deposition machines, and testers that equip its fabs. But critically, not a single one of those imported tools was the latest and greatest for cutting-edge logic fabs. Thanks to US export controls, Chinese companies can't buy the top-tier equipment needed for sub-14 nanometer manufacturing. This has effectively frozen China out of the high-end tool market. No EUV from ASML, no advanced scanners from Nikon, no state-of-the-art EUV photoresists from Japan, etc. What's left is often older generation tools, which China has stockpiled aggressively, and a push to build its own equipment. China does have some domestic tool champions in the making. Think of companies like Nora Etch and Deposition Tools and AMEC Etch Tools. Interestingly, since the US clampdown, these Chinese toolmakers have seen surging demand from local fabs, partially filling the gap left by Applied Materials and Lam Research. AMEC forecasted over 40 to 50% revenue growth for 2023 on orders from Chinese fabs hungry for homegrown alternatives. But let's be clear, while companies like Nora and AMEC are making strides, they are still years behind the Applieds and Lams of the world in technology. And China's one domestic lithography producer, SMEE, so far can only produce DUV scanners for nodes like 90 nanometers, with hopes to reach approximately 28 nanometers by mid-2020s. Building a world-class lithography machine, the crown jewel of semiconductor equipment, is an enormous challenge that took ASML decades and a global supply chain to achieve. On the materials side, China is a major supplier of certain raw inputs. It refines the majority of the world's rare earths, for example, and is leveraging that as both a strength and a geopolitical tool. In mid-2023, after facing chip sanctions, Beijing retaliated by imposing export controls on gallium and germanium, obscure metals vital for some semiconductor substrates and high-speed chips. By late 2024, it added antimony to the restricted list, and in early 2025, indium, all critical materials in chip making. These moves signal that China is willing to use its dominance in certain materials as a bargaining chip, no pun intended, in the tech war. However, in core semiconductor materials like leading-edge silicon wafers, photoresists, and specialty gases, China still depends heavily on imports from Japan, Europe, and the US. Despite these hurdles, China's strategy for equipment and materials autonomy is now in overdrive. Beijing is effectively telling its industry, develop an entire semiconductor tool chain domestically, step by step. The plan is a multi-year, multi-node roadmap. First prove you can make 40-nanometer chips with all Chinese tools, then 28-nanometer, then 14-nanometer, and so on. According to American Affairs analyst Paul Triolo, Chinese fabs are methodically working with local toolmakers to validate equipment at each stage, essentially trying to bridge to an all-Chinese production line in the future. If they succeed, down the line, China could run fabs that use almost no foreign equipment or materials. But getting there will be painstaking. None of this is happening in a vacuum either. The US is likely to further tighten controls. Indeed, in late 2023, it even expanded restrictions to certain high-end DUV tools, moving the goalposts as China improved. And other countries like Japan have joined with their own curbs on exporting chip equipment to China. So the supply chain gap remains a tough trench to cross. At the end of the day, China spends far more on importing chip equipment than it earns selling it. Chinese firms hold only approximately 2% of the global semiconductor equipment market. Until those numbers flip, China's chip making will remain reliant on foreign technology to some degree. If money alone could solve the chip gap, China might have closed it by now. After all, over $150 billion of government funds were pledged from 2014 through 2030 to build up the semiconductor sector. But the effectiveness of that spending comes down to R&D and talent. How innovative and skilled is China's chip ecosystem really? There are two sides to this coin. On one hand, China is churning out patents and graduates at astonishing rates. In 2021 to 2022, 55% of global semiconductor patent applications originated from China, double the number from the United States. China is also awarding huge numbers of engineering degrees. Its universities and polytechnics are pumping out young talent eager to work on chips. The country has set up dozens of national labs and research institutes for semiconductors, from silicon photonics to AI chips. And as sanctions bite, Beijing has further ramped up R&D investment, launching new state-backed funds, e.g., a reported $40 billion fund announced in late 2023 to support the chip industry, and tasking universities to focus on core tech research. In early 2023, the government even designated 5 key firms, Huawei, SMIC, YMTC, Nora, and AMEC, to get privileged access to government R&D and unlimited funding to solve bottleneck technologies. This whole-of-nation mobilization shows in things like scientific papers too. China's share of top semiconductor research publications has been rising. But here's the other side: quality and efficiency of R&D. For all the patents filed, many Chinese chip companies still lag in true innovation. One telling metric is R&D intensity, the percentage of revenue spent on R&D. Chinese semiconductor firms average about 7.6% R&D intensity, which is less than half of US firms' 18.8%, and also below European and Taiwanese firms. Partly this is because many Chinese chip businesses are in mature, lower-margin segments, where companies historically spend less on R&D. By contrast, leading-edge players like Intel, TSMC, Nvidia, etc. pour enormous sums into R&D to stay at the cutting edge, often 15 to 20% of revenue. The gap suggests that Chinese firms may not be investing enough in the kind of breakthrough research needed for true leadership. There's also a talent gap in experience. While China produces lots of young engineers, it doesn't yet have as many veteran chip experts with 20 to 30 years of experience. The kind of know-how that comes from successfully bringing multiple chip generations to market. Much of that expertise still resides in Taiwan, the US, South Korea, and Japan. Some Chinese companies have tried to poach foreign talent, offering big salaries to Taiwanese engineers, for example, with limited success and sometimes running afoul of IP theft accusations. Globally, the chip industry is facing a talent crunch, an estimated 67,000 worker shortfall in the US by 2030 alone. China faces its own version of this, a shortage of chip architects, EDA software specialists, and semiconductor manufacturing experts. It's not that Chinese students can't learn these skills, they are, but mastering cutting-edge chip design or process engineering often requires working on the real thing, which means access to leading fabs and tools. US restrictions that bar American companies from facilitating advanced node work in China also indirectly constrain training opportunities. In response, China is expanding domestic training programs. It created a new National Integrated Circuit Talent Training Base and is encouraging industry-university partnerships so that curricula align with what fabs need. Still, talent development is a long game. As one industry CEO quipped, "In semiconductors, experience is the hardest IP to accelerate." The takeaway: China is unquestionably upping its game in R&D and training, more money, more patents, more grads. Yet, by traditional measures of innovation output and talent depth, it still trails the leading chip nations. A Chinese firm has yet to introduce a groundbreaking process technology or a world-leading commercial chip on its own timeline. Most Chinese firsts are replays of what others did a few years earlier. Bridging that innovation gap will require not just cash, but creating an environment where top talent and ideas can flourish, and where failure is tolerated as part of pushing boundaries. It remains to be seen if the current state-driven approach can cultivate that kind of Silicon Valley-esque innovation culture. Chips are as much about design as they are about manufacturing. Even if you have the fabs and tools, you need to design cutting-edge chips and have the software to do so. This is where EDA, electronic design automation tools, and semiconductor IP, intellectual property like processor architectures, come into play. For decades, the EDA industry has been dominated by 3 US firms, Synopsys, Cadence, and Mentor, Siemens, whose software is indispensable for designing complex chips. Today, that's a chokehold. Chinese chip designers still rely heavily on these foreign EDA tools, which is a vulnerability as export rules tighten. How is China doing in this domain? China has made EDA a priority since Made in China 2025, recognizing it as a weak link. A number of Chinese EDA startups and companies have emerged. Empyrean Technology is a leading example. Empyrean claims that its tools can now fully support 7-nanometer digital design and 5-nanometer analog design. If true, that's a big step forward, as it suggests Chinese designers could potentially use domestic software for chips one generation behind the cutting edge. Several other local EDA firms, Guangzhou XT, Primarius, XEpic, etc., are also developing niche tools and have collectively grown their share of China's internal EDA market from just 6% in 2018 to about 11.5% by 2020, with a projection of 14% by 2025. Moreover, in 2023, China launched a national EDA innovation center in Nanjing, aiming to coordinate academia and industry to break the US chokehold on chip design software. The goal is to build an independent EDA ecosystem and even tackle future tech like tools for GAA transistors the upcoming transistor architecture beyond FinFET. However, despite this progress, Chinese EDA still has a long way to go. Even Chinese experts admit that for now, domestic tools cannot fully replace Synopsys or Cadence for the most complex chips. Often, local tools handle parts of the workflow, maybe analog circuit design or certain verification steps, but a full suite that's on par with the international leaders is not yet there. The best-case scenario in the short term is Chinese firms using a mix of domestic and foreign EDA while steadily improving the former. The US knows EDA is a pressure point. It has already barred the sale of EDA tools that support GAA transistor design needed for sub-3 nanometers to China. So the EDA gap is real. As of today, if you want to design a 5 nanometer or 3 nanometer chip, you pretty much must use American software. China might be 5+ years away from a truly competitive alternative, though they're sprinting to close that gap. What about IP like processor cores and architectures? Here, China has an intriguing strategy: go open source. Instead of trying to reinvent proprietary IP like ARM or x86, China is heavily promoting RISC-V, an open-source instruction set architecture. RISC-V allows anyone to develop their own CPU core without paying royalties, and Chinese companies and government have embraced it as a pathway to reduce reliance on Western tech. In fact, Chinese players are major contributors to RISC-V's development, and Beijing sees it as a chance to foster a homegrown ecosystem of processors. Already we see Chinese startups and even big firms, Alibaba's T-Head for instance, designing RISC-V-based chips for IoT and even servers. The government has backed RISC-V research centers and encouraged its use in everything from appliances to supercomputers. This is a smart end run around Western IP domination, but it's long-term. RISC-V cores need to prove themselves against ARM cores in performance and software compatibility, which will take time and effort. Aside from RISC-V, China's fabless chip design companies have been a relative bright spot. Firms like Huawei's HiSilicon, AI chip startup Byron, and others have shown they can design very sophisticated chips. HiSilicon's Kirin mobile processors, for example, were on par with Qualcomm's until sanctions hit. In fact, Chinese fabless companies held about 16% of the global fabless chip market in 2020, ranking third after the US and Taiwan. They've made inroads in products like smartphone SoCs, AI accelerators, image sensors, and network chips. The catch: these designs were fabbed mostly outside China. TSMC used to manufacture many of HiSilicon's most advanced designs. Now, with TSMC off-limits for sanctioned firms, some of that design prowess is in limbo. What's the use of a world-class 5 nanometer chip design if you can't manufacture it? This is precisely why China's working on all fronts: design, using EDA and IP, manufacturing, and the glue in between. To truly gauge how far behind China is, we must note that in chip design, the lag is perhaps the smallest. Some experts say Chinese logic chip designs are only a couple of years behind the cutting edge, thanks to the likes of HiSilicon, before sanctions, and others. But in the design ecosystem, EDA IP, that enables those chips, China remains dependent and perhaps 5 to 10 years behind the leaders. Bridging that will require not just coding complex software, but also overcoming network effects. Everyone uses existing tools because they're proven. It's an uphill battle, but one China is compelled to fight for the sake of autonomy.